We've now developed a picture for the long-run equilibrium in the market. In the long run, the price must have settled to the zero long-run profit price through entry and exit, so that when we sum all the short-run supply curves for the individual firms in the market, it sums to a short-run market supply curve that crosses demand at that zero long-run profit price. So there's no incentive for firms to leave the industry, no incentive for firms outside of the industry to enter. We've also shown how a sequence of changes could be set off in the market picture if demand shifts. If demand shifts, there's going to be a change in the price. So if the demand shifts out, price will increase, the market will produce more, each firm will produce more in the short run, but in the long run, more firms will enter because the price will be above the zero long run profit price, and that entry is going to shift that short run supply curve until price settles back to the original price. But that's not the only thing that can happen. There could be a sequence of changes that gets set off in the other picture if there's a change in the costs for the firms. And the relevant costs that we're going to keep track of are the costs that change the long-run average cost curve and the costs that change the short-run marginal cost curve that gives rise to the short-run supply curve for the firm. So the two kinds of shifts we're going to look for in this picture that might set off a sequence of changes are changes in the short-run marginal cost and changes in the long-run average cost, because those are the two curves that show up in this picture. So one example of a cost that might change is a recurring fixed cost. So a cost like a license fee. So suppose we have an increase in a recurring fixed cost. Well, we know that a fixed cost doesn't show up in short-run marginal cost curves, so it wouldn't cause any change in these curves. It will change the long-run average cost curve. So we want to look at the long-run average cost curve. So we start with our original long-run average cost curve. And we say, well, what if we add a recurring fixed cost to this? Well, a fixed cost is going to change the average cost a lot if we produce very few units, because we're spreading that fixed cost across few units. But the more units we produce, the less of a difference it's going to make in the average costs, because we're spreading the fixed cost over more units. So we'll get a new long-run average cost curve that's going to converge to the original one as we produce more, which means that that lowest point of the long-run average cost curve is going to go up because we've seen an increase in the recurring fixed cost, but it's also going to shift to the right. So it's going to shift to the right, which means in a new long-run equilibrium, the firms are going to end up producing more than they did originally, but the long-run equilibrium price will be higher. Another way to see why that lowest point has to shift to the right is to think about what would happen to the long-run marginal cost curve. Marginal cost curves cross average cost curves at their lowest point. So if we haven't changed the long-run marginal cost curve, fixed costs don't change those curves, we have an upward sloping marginal cost curve that crosses at this point and it keeps sloping up. So if there's a higher average cost curve, it's got to cross that marginal cost curve that's upward sloping, so that lowest point has to lie to the right. A second kind of cost that we'll encounter is a per unit cost. An example of that would be a per unit tax. So think about a per unit tax of little t. So for every unit that the firm produces, it now has to pay a tax of a certain amount. Well, that is a change in marginal costs. It now costs more to bring a good to market and sell it because you have to pay this per unit tax. So it's going to affect our short-run marginal costs. And of course, it's also going to affect our long-run average costs. So if we draw that change in costs, we'll start with our initial long-run average cost. We'll add our short-run supply curve, because that is part of the short-run marginal cost curve. And we know that the per unit tax is going to shift both of those up. And since it's the same amount for every good that we produce, it's going to push everything up by exactly that amount. So the average cost is going to go up by that amount everywhere. And the supply curve, that short-run marginal cost curve, is also going to shift up by exactly that amount. Well, that means that the lowest point is going to stay at exactly the same point as it did before. All the curves are just shifting up in a parallel way. Which means in the new long-run equilibrium, price will be higher, but the firms will produce the same quantity as they did originally. A third kind of cost is going to be a change in the rental rate of capital. Now, capital is fixed in the short run, so it's not a short-run marginal cost. So it wouldn't change the short-run marginal cost curve. It'll just change our long-run average cost curve. So if we graph that, we just have to start with our long-run average cost curve. And we're going to look at an increase in the rental rate. And we know that increase in the rental rate will make things more expensive, so that long-run average cost curve is going to shift up. But we actually don't know which way it's going to shift the lowest point of that curve. So the lowest point originally happens here. It may be that it shifts it in a way that looks like an increase in the recurring fixed cost, so that that lowest point shifts to the right. But it may also shift it so that the lowest point shifts to the left. So it could be that it shifts it in a way where it ends up over here, or it could end up somewhere over here with the lowest point to the left, or it could shift straight up like it did here. Without more information, we don't know. What we do know is that it shifts up, so that the long-run equilibrium price is going to rise. But we don't know if the firms are going to end up producing less or more or the same unless we have more information. Finally, we could have a change in the wage. A change in the wage is a change in the short-run cost. Labor is a short-run variable input. So it is going to affect the short-run marginal cost curve, and it's also going to affect the long-run average cost curve. So when we increase wages, we'll see a change in both of those, and the change in the long-run average cost curve will look very much like a change in the long-run average cost curve from an increase in the rental rate. They're both changes in an input cost. So again, for an increase in the wage, we're not going to know, unless we have more information, whether that lowest point shifts to the left or shifts to the right. But for the short-run supply curve, which comes from the short-run marginal cost curve, we'll also know that when we increase the wage, that short-run supply curve is going to shift up. The short-run marginal cost for every unit we produce is now going to shift up because labor has become more expensive, so that we'll get an upward shift in the short-run marginal cost curve. So these are the basic kinds of changes in costs the firm might experience. And if all the firms in the industry experience that, it's going to result in a change in this picture. If it only happens to a single firm, if there's a license fee that's imposed only on a single firm, or a tax that's imposed only on a single firm, or for some reason only a single firm's rental rate or wage change, then there's only a change in this picture for that one single firm, and it's actually not going to affect anything in the market picture. But if those cost changes happen for every firm, then they're going to translate into changes in this picture, which will then feed back into the original picture.